Hey up viewers and viewresses, my name is General Red Strategist and I'm bringing you a special video to mark the 100th episode of my Sir You're Being Hunted series. Now, I wondered what I'd do for this 100th video in the series, because I felt like I had to do something kind of special, considering that Sir is probably the most popular series on my channel. So, I had an idea. I looked back on the General Red Reflects Wolfenstein video I did a while ago, and decided that I might do something similar for Sir. So, namely, this video is going to be a general discussion of why I enjoy Sir as much as I do. Now, it's going to be split into two kind of sections. The first section is going to be just me making a few general points about what I love about the game, and after that I'll do a section where I'm just going to sort of ramble about where I think the developers could take the game in the future. But that's all I'll say by way of a kind of introduction. Other than that, let's just throw ourselves straight into this what will probably be another mammoth video like the General Red Reflects Wolfenstein one was. So, where do we start? I suppose we could begin with the basic premise of the game. Now, Sir You're Being Hunted is a survival title. Nothing inherently special there. After all, I don't know about all you people who are watching this, but to me, right now, it certainly feels like there's a heck of a lot of survival titles on the market, right now at least. You know, we can think of some examples like Don't Starve, Stranded Deep, The Forest, The Long Dark, 7 Days to Die, DayZ, Zombie, Rust, Subnautica. You know, those are all just several examples, but I'll bet you there's plenty more that we can think of. Now, don't get me wrong, I've played a few of those titles myself, like, you remember that a while back I did a playthrough of The Forest. I currently have playthroughs of Don't Starve and Stranded Deep on the go. And, you know, I also have Subnautica, which I play in my spare time. All these games, they're a heck of a lot of fun to play, but the point I'm trying to make is that in a market which seems to me at least to be becoming rather crowded, survival games need to stand out in order to have a chance of success. Now, quite a few of them do, of course, because, you know, you have like Don't Starve with its very unique art style, you have The Forest with its creepy setting and progressively freakier enemies. Then you have like Stranded Deep and Subnautica with their ominous ocean environments, which I don't think really any other survival game has tried out before. But there are plenty of other survival titles, I imagine, which do not stand out and which just sort of fade into the background as a result. Now, this is first and foremost where I think Sir You're Being Hunted kind of shines, because Sir did not just become another forgotten survival title, and when you look at the game's premise, you can see why. The premise of Sir is actually quite simple. You survive in a sinister world where evil robots hunt humans for sport. But what makes it really stand out is the distinctly British theme that's going on in it. The environments are supposed to be reminiscent of the British countryside. The robots themselves dress like Victorian gentry, and many of the game's little touches, from the sort of red phone booths and postboxes right down to the squire doing his rendition of Rule Britannia, are basically designed to have a hint of Britishness about them. Now, to me, that automatically makes the game stand out, because off the top of my head, I can't think of any other game which opted for a kind of British countryside theme and setting. Plus, of course, it does help that I am from Britain myself, so naturally there's an instant appeal. But the success of Sir's premise is also shown by the fact that it doesn't just appeal to gamers from the UK, because if the sort of feedback I've seen on my videos, on the Sir forums, on the Sir Steam page and in other places is anything to go by, the game does have plenty of players from well outside the UK, people who you might not necessarily expect to immediately pick up on all the little hints of Britishness or understand them necessarily. Now, the environments in Sir are, in my opinion, an ideal setting for a survival game, especially one with a kind of air of comic creepiness like Sir has. There's something about the British countryside, ranging from like the Scottish Highlands in the north right down to the rolling green wolds of South England, that kind of makes such areas ideal for survival horror, at least in my opinion, and undoubtedly in the opinion of the developers as well. And the different biomes in Sir enable some pretty unique environments. So like you have the bleak rural biomes to the overcast grey mountain biomes, you have the marshy fens, the dirty built-up industrial biome, and the crumbling castle biome. Now sure, the graphics in Sir are hardly next-gen and/or cutting-edge, but to me that doesn't matter so much, because good graphics don't automatically make a good game. There's far more that goes into a game in order to make it good than just the visuals, and for what the developers of Sur had at their disposal, I reckon they did a pretty decent job. The environment visuals are of a good enough standard, but what makes them really come to life for me are the little touches. Now, here we're talking especially about the sound design. Now, for me, good sound design is everything in a game. Sound is, in my opinion, the primary means for immersing the player in an environment, not necessarily visuals. I don't know about all you people watching this, but if I'm playing a game and the sound just doesn't grab me, then there is a good chance that I just won't really be able to get that immersed in the setting, and as a result I won't enjoy it perhaps as much as I could do. Luckily, the developers of Sur, I think, pretty much got the sound design spot on. The moment you spawn into a new map in Sur, there are little sound details that convey the British countryside setting. I'm talking now about like the breeze in the air, the sound of crows calling to each other, the kind of rustle of the grass and vegetation beneath your character's feet. Objects that make noise sound like their actual real-life counterparts, especially the guns. Those kind of crashing booms that the shotgun, the rifle and the blunderbuss make. Now there's something I love about those sounds, the kind of strength in them and the way they sort of reverberate across the environment. Moving on though to something else about the game. The mechanics of Sur are beautifully simple and straightforward, in my opinion. There's a health meter, there's a hunger meter that steadily decreases and which has to be topped up every so often. Both of those, of course, are pretty standard fare in a survival title, but there's also a unique meter, one which is kind of special to Sur, and that, of course, is the visibility meter. There's nothing complicated about it, it essentially tells you how likely it is that enemies will see you, but it's so important to the gameplay, and the way in which you can use the natural environment around you to keep the meter low is well done, in my opinion. Then of course there's like limited combat mechanics, there's stealth mechanics, there's hunting mechanics, there's even a mechanic purely dedicated for your situational awareness. I'm talking of course about the track IR system, which enables you to look around as you're moving without the need for any overly complicated controls. And that brings us to something else, the controls. There's nothing overly complex about them. The moment I started playing Sur, it really didn't take me that long, if I remember correctly, to actually master the controls, and I like it when game controls are fairly straightforward and easy to master quickly. There's an inventory button, there's a hotkey for bandages, slots for items and associated hotkeys, and the like. If there's one thing I do sometimes find irritable in games, it's when you have a title where there are so many mechanics that the controls actually become a bit awkward and or they take time to master. I'm sure plenty of you will agree with me on this, but when I play a game, I want to be able to just sit down and quickly get into the swing of things. I don't want to have to worry about the possibility of accidentally pressing the wrong button that results in me wasting medkit, or taking an unnaturally long amount of time to do a very simple task just because there are so many like fiddly buttons I have to press in the right combination. Fortunately, Sur doesn't have this problem, and I rate it well because of that. But of course, the stars of the show in Sur You're Being Hunted are undoubtedly the antagonists. There's something I find very simple, and yet at the same time brilliant, about their basic concept. On the one hand, they're basically a bunch of robots who go about killing humans. There's nothing original about that in itself. I'm sure there are plenty of games out there that featured human slaughtering machines long before Sur ever came out. But the idea to make them so comically creepy, to have them dress up in Victorian British fashion and mimic Victorian British mannerisms, is what makes them stand out. In that respect, they do have a degree of originality, and even better, there are different variants with different traits and personalities and mechanics. You have the bog-standard hunters, which are like the shotgun-toting aristocratic cads, the sneaking poachers, which are the sort of working-class scoundrels. You have the jolly squires, the sort of middle-class chortlers who can quickly turn nasty if you provoke them. You have the delightfully creepy scarecrows, the relentless landowner. You have the riders, you have the hounds. Then, to make matters even more interesting, you have to worry about a balloon in the sky, which adds a degree of verticality to it, and a sea beast that makes long spells in the water undesirable. But something else I will mention, which I thought was good about the game, was that underneath all of that, underneath the enemies, underneath the environments, underneath the mechanics and the controls, underneath everything, there's a deeper storyline. In fact, come to think of it, there are actually two storylines in Sur, in a manner of speaking. There's the immediate plot line, which is basically you, the player, finding yourself trapped in this strange British countryside world even, having to evade death at the hands of sinister mechanical oddities as you struggle to survive and find the pieces of the teleportation device that will return you home. But then there's a hidden storyline, one that is not explicitly told. It's a storyline that you actually have to search for. You have to look for it in all the creepily abandoned and unoccupied buildings. And it's the underlying story of this world, which is revealed in kind of snippets through various letters and books that generate randomly across the map when you start a new game. It's a story of sinister overlap phenomena between worlds, of humans meddling with such phenomena, and of humans then finding themselves facing terrible consequences in robotic forms. And it's brilliant, in my opinion. At least I think I've understood that very well from what I've played of Sur so far. Now, one problem that games of all genres can tend to have or have to watch out for is that after hours and hours spent playing them, the player does kind of learn all the mechanics and becomes sufficiently practiced enough that the game becomes repetitive or loses its challenge, and in turn it kind of loses its captivating factors. Sur, of course, does attempt to address this in three ways. Firstly, you have a player class system. Choose a certain class, whether that be aristocrat, gamekeeper, officer, artist, inventor, cook, old soak, and you'll be given certain starting kits at the beginning of a new game, which forces you to adapt your playstyle in the early stages. Secondly, you have a procedural generation system. You start a new game and you won't get the same world twice. You can even set the biomes and even tweak their settings in order to produce some interesting landscapes of your own. Thirdly, you can even tweak the robot spawn settings. Do you want to just have a relaxing stroll around the British countryside and admire the scenery? Easy, you just turn off all the robots. Or do you want to try a hardcore playthrough of the game? Simple, you just max out all the robot settings and throw yourself in. By adding these kind of mechanics, the developers have added some variation to the game that should be able to keep you interested for a long time. So, overall, those are the points I think that make Sur such an enjoyable experience for me, even now as I reach the 100th episode in this series. Of course, I'm not going to suggest that Sur is a perfect game, because let's be realistic, it isn't. There are still a few kind of kinks that the developers should perhaps have a look at, but those tend to be very little things, like the balloon, for example, occasionally floating through what should be solid objects at high altitudes, or the possibility that developers may want to consider giving some of the junk items actual uses, rather than just having them present for the sake of variety. But despite those little things, my overall impression of the game remains very, very positive, and the fact that there's now a multiplayer component is quite simply an added bonus. So that's the first kind of section of this video done out the way. That's why I enjoy Sur. Now let's move on to the second and what could be probably the longer section of the video. Where could the developers take the game next? So basically, in other words, the remainder of this video is pretty much just going to be me kind of prattling about random ideas for things that could be implemented in a game like this. I highly doubt, of course, that the developers watch my Sur videos and never mind listen to my ideas and suggestions. But there is also a small modding community around Sur, and you never know. Maybe one of them will watch this section of the video and be inspired to try their hand at creating something. Some of you might ask, of course, General, if you have ideas, why don't you try your hand at them? Well, the simple answer to that is I wouldn't know where the heck to begin, because I'm not a game designer, I'm not computer programming, I don't know anything about such things. You know, I have a creative streak in me, but in this instance I would need someone else to actually put my creative ideas into being. So, what kind of things could you add to Sur to make it even more interesting? Some of my first ideas were perhaps to implement some more biome types, maybe with unique characteristics and designs. You have a couple of existing biomes in the game which are clearly based on certain areas of the UK. The Fens biome, for example, that's very clearly based on the actual fens of East Anglia, and the industrial biome, in my opinion, is most likely based on England's industrial north. So How about adding more biomes which are based on particular locations within the British Isles, which would easily fit with the British theme? What about, say, for example, a fells biome, which is loosely based on the fells of Cumbria? This could be like a fairly light, bright green biome with rolling hills and crags. There wouldn't be much tree cover, but there would be man-made structures, which would mostly take the form of like isolated farmhouses and barns and little old stone walls. Sticking with Cumbria, what about a lakes biome? You could have a light, bright green island with a large lake that takes up much of the centre, maybe with a couple of small wooded islands in the middle. You could have like quaint little cobbled villages with small boats even, moored around the lake's edges. How about something different? What about a moors biome, based on the bleak moors of Lancashire and Yorkshire? These could be a very challenging biome to remain unseen in, with sort of greyish rolling hills, an overcast sky, and very little cover of any sort, whether that be trees, rocks or vegetation. In such a biome, buildings would perhaps be limited to just a few isolated houses, making scavenging more of a challenge. What else? How about a sands or mudflats biome, loosely based on the likes of Morecambe Bay and the surrounding area? Now here you could have like a coastal theme with low terrain, boat wrecks where you can find supplies, and huge swathes of like intertidal sands which can impede the movements of the player and other NPCs. How about we go further northward instead to Scotland? What about a cold, frosty loch or highlands biome? In fact, actually, who remembers Dear Esther, which I did a playthrough of quite some time ago now? Now that game, Dear Esther, was set in the Hebrides, which are just off the Scottish coast, so they're very much a UK kind of setting. So what about a Hebridean biome, which would be all like windswept and barren, with like abandoned lighthouses and the hulks of beached fishing trawlers everywhere? That would be possibly an interesting one. Now how about we go south again? How about, let's say, a quarry biome based on the old mining industry of Wales? You could like have an island with a huge sort of wide depression in the land at the very centre, or craggy and rocky, with all kinds of interesting man-made structures in and around it, like railway tracks or overhead ropeway conveyors, head frames, quarry buildings. A biome like that, for example, might have a greater likelihood of dynamite spawning throughout its structures to give it a unique characteristic. Now, here's an even more radical idea. How about having some like secret biomes that cannot be selected from the custom generation menu, but which instead only have a small chance of being generated when you set an island's biome to random? Now for these you could like feature some truly wacky, very different environments. How about like a capital biome, which would be a unique and more urban environment based on the likes of London, Bath, York, or other historical British cities? You could have wide cobbled streets with rusting abandoned old route masters, bordered by structures like high Georgian townhouses. Or how about like a seaside biome, which would be like another urban type environment, this time based on the likes of old British seaside resort towns like Brighton or Margate. The island could be predominantly made up of sandy beaches, at the centre of which would be promenades overlooked by old-fashioned guest houses, and there'd be like wide cobbled streets with tracks and old disused trams. I think the point I'm trying to make basically is there are so many locations in the UK from which the developers or modders even could take inspiration for the game, so why not look into it? What else could you add to Sur to make it even bigger and better besides new biomes? What about taking some existing features and giving them uses? Take like the junk items that you find in the buildings. I mentioned this before. It might be interesting for the developers to, give some of them uses. I mean, some of them could have uses. The cracked teapots and the patriotic crockery, for example. You could just throw them like the empty bottles. Or what about like environmental objects? What about the telephone booths and the post boxes? Now, the telephone booths technically do have a use already, as they are counted as lootable structures. But here's an idea. What if you could use your trusty pliers to tinker with the phone so that Walters can take control of it from his dimension and make it ring upon command? You could use it as like a distraction technique. And as for the post boxes, those currently have no use, but an idea I had was that you could use them as a kind of specialised storage space. Think of the ender chests in Minecraft, Perhaps you could do something similar with the post boxes. At least one of them could generate per island. You could deposit items in one, and if you go to another island to find the post box there, you could open it and all your items would be posted to it, so you could take them out. You could put them in on one island and take them out on another, basically. Let's have a sip of tea whilst I'm at it. I've got a cup of tea, nice and British for talking about a very British game. But moving on, what else? How about you could add to the British theme by implementing some new food mechanics? Take the log piles that you find scattered throughout the world. The only real use for those at present is to cook the raw meat you acquire from hunting rabbits and pheasants. Plus, sometimes you might also use them as a means of diverting the robot's attention by creating fire and smoke. But what if you could acquire an item in the game, perhaps like a rusty pan or something along those lines, that you could place on a burning log pile and then mix food items in to create meals that would replenish huge amounts of hunger points? You could add all kinds of food items, and different combinations could make uniquely British dishes from all across the country. Let's say eggs and bacon, or perhaps even a full English breakfast. How about a Welsh rarebit? Or how about making the haggis and the fish and chips into meals that you actually have to craft? How about Yorkshire pudding, Sunday roasts and different kinds of pie, like steak and ale, meat and potato or Cornish stargazy? How about ploughman's lunches, Cornish pasties, potted shrimps, toad in the hole, Devonshire cream tea and scones, Lancashire hot pot, bangers and mash, bubble and squeak, cucumber sandwiches, cauliflower cheese? All different possibilities that developers or modders could pick and choose from in sort of line with the British theme. In fact, the idea of being able to make different types of meal combinations raises another vaguely related possibility, one that might actually elicit some different opinions, which might actually be a little bit divisive, since this could be quite a stretch that would require some serious programming in the game. But I'll suggest it anyway, as it is food for thought. How about some form of limited crafting system? You could combine items in your inventory to make new things. How about a crude incendiary made by combining one of Sir's bottled alcohols with some kind of flammable item? In essence, a Molotov cocktail of sorts. What if you could implement new items that, when combined, can be used to craft the likes of booby traps, decoys, or objects for a campsite? Moving on, how about some additional weapons? There's already one quite strong melee weapon, which is the wood hatchet, but this is a heavy object that takes a second or two to swing. How about a smaller, lighter melee weapon like a hunting knife that does less damage but which can be drawn and swung much faster? Now, there's already a small but effective range of firearms with a wide array of characteristics, such as the short-range revolver, the mid-range shotgun, the long-range rifle, and the area of effect blunderbuss. But how about adding some Easter egg weapons of a distinctly British character in line with the British theme? These could be like extremely rare finds, such as a 2 or 4-barreled Victorian Lancaster pistol, or a 7-barreled Royal Navy knock volley gun, or a wide-bore elephant gun. Of course, as I said, any such armaments would probably be best implemented as Easter eggs rather than mainstream weapons. Finally, how about some new and interesting NPCs? There are already quite a range of robots, but you could add more with their own mechanics. How about a beta, for example, a robot who spawns with a group of hunters and who acts as a kind of scout or pointer, spying out game in the undergrowth and forcing it out for the hunters to shoot at? An enemy like this could be rare, but have a greater line of sight and a greater ability to spot hiding players at larger distances. Or, in a similar vein to the Squire, how about another neutral robot whose behaviour towards the player changes depending on their actions? For example, let's say a carter, a robot who drives a mechanical horse-pulled carriage, or couldn't get that word out for a second then, cart or carriage between villages. You could hide in the back of his car in order to avoid detection by other robots, but when you decide to get out you have to pay him or he becomes aggressive. You could even implement a currency item for that, like old British shillings or farthings. How about something to complement the balloon, like an armed narrowboat that patrols the island's edges maybe? Because in all the time I've played Sir, quite often I've found that sneaking around the island's coast is usually quite a safe way to avoid robots, as few robots in my experience at least, tend to wander out that far. And of course the sea beast can only reach you if you're practically right next to or in the water. So having a waterborne enemy that behaves in a sort of patrolling way would add an extra challenge, I think. Or, if not a water-based vehicle type enemy, what about a land-based vehicle of some kind, like an old Victorian steamroller or steam traction engine that the robots use to crush their way through the undergrowth? I mean, of course, those are some pretty out there ideas, and they would of course require a fair bit of programming, but there's something to think about. Perhaps you could tweak the AI of existing robots so that their behaviour changes depending on other factors, such as the time of day, maybe, for example. So, like, what if, for example, all the hunters, hounds and squires at night congregate in villages or near large structures and enter some kind of sleep mode in which they become relatively inactive, whilst on the other hand, other robots become far more active at night, like the poachers, for example. They could become bolder at night, leaving their thickets and actually prowling about in the open. So that's something else to think about. Now, new NPCs wouldn't necessarily even have to be robots. There are already 3 non-robotic NPCs in the game: the rabbits, the pheasants and the crows that you can accidentally disturb if you're not careful. But how about adding to that list? What about some non-robotic enemies? You could add, like, hideous humanoid beasts named after creatures from British folklore, and you could explain them in the storyline as kind of like mutations, humans who were forced to change and adapt in order to survive in the wild following the robotic invasion even. How about, for example, an Ichi, a screaming skull, a black anise or a Jenny Greenteeth? These sort of feral monsters could be rare and only found in certain biomes or environments. Their AI could be designed so that they are aggressive to the player but afraid of the robots. The robots in turn could attack and chase them with as much vigour as they would if they were chasing the player. That's pretty much exhausts my list of ideas for what sort of things you could implement in SIR. There was no real purpose to doing this other than to discuss what sort of directions the game could go in next, because now that multiplayer has actually been implemented, I don't actually know what the developers are planning on next, or if maybe they're just like focusing massively on getting a load of the single player assets into multiplayer for the time being. But hopefully this video might provoke some interesting thoughts from all you viewers out there. And as I said before, who knows, maybe there'll be like some modder who's watching this who might suddenly think, oh, that's an interesting idea, I wonder if I could have a go at implementing something like that in the game. But other than that, I have little else to say for this video. So, to conclude, SIR You're Being Hunted is a very, very good game with a lot of potential to go further. Let's just hope that the developers don't run out of ideas, of course. As a survival game, it has its own unique premise that helps it stand out from the crowd, and I utterly love this game for the amount of fun and content I've managed to get out of it. So, leave your own thoughts on SIR in the comments below. This pretty much concludes this 100th episode special for SIR. Hope you've all enjoyed, but in the meantime, this is General Red, signing off. Goodbye. Whoa, Jesus Christ! Holy shit! Fucking hell! Bloody hell, that did like 1,000,000 damage! This better not be a... Whoa! Shit! No! Oh my fucking god! How many... What? Holy shit!